Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 7 out of 8. Transmission begins. It discusses what I've learned from my extreme experiences and just how common those uncommon experiences really are. I am Michael, and I had a secret. Now I've walked you through the important parts of my story and I've shown you that secret. I had to, but I never wanted to. The last thing I could ever have wanted was to tell you my secret. Well, actually, to be honest, the last thing I could ever have wanted was to be asked for it in the first place. The telling comes way after the limit of what I was comfortable with or what I could have wanted. But I got asked so many times because YouTube has provided this weird little soapbox, so the responsibility of standing on it and saying the unsayable out loud fell on me. First, because I'm the only one who can have responsibility for that particular question. Second, because I happen to also be responsible for the secret you never intended to ask about. And third, because I've got a responsibility to both those who are out there like me and those who we are absolutely going to make like me in the future if we don't take responsibility for making sure stories like mine either never begin or at a bare minimum never get forced into becoming secrets in the first place. Like I already said, I use the English language extremely precisely. That's because what I'm trying to do is communicate. Actually communicate, not merely convey. There is no point in merely conveying what happened to me. In fact, there's less than no point. To do that would just be handing you my secret, a book wrapped up as a gift that you might hold but never open, much less read, much less understand. That even if you did read, you'd interpret. The more generous might think they'd found a brave hero telling the truth, when I'm a coward and sometimes villain who has viciously omitted what wouldn't further my plot. The less than generous might see a whiner, when I'm not complaining about what happened to me, but rather about what is happening right now to others. The most miserly will see a liar, but I dare them to ever come anywhere near as close as I've just done to letting themselves, much less everyone else, near their darkest truth. I am aching to communicate, literally aching. Since I started to write this, I have been self-harming again. I have been causing myself constant, sometimes violent, physical pain for months now. And I've been doing that in a conscious attempt to bring your worldview into alignment with my own, even if just for a fleeting moment, so that we are looking at the same page of the same book, if not necessarily from the same solar system. I have been causing myself real, permanent damage in order to even attempt to communicate, to discover the right protocol and volume and shape to hammer the message into, so that it can be both sent and received, so that the meaning arrives with it, so that we together are in communion, literally sharing a perspective, even when we are very, very far apart and moving in perpendicular directions. From everything I've described, every experience I've related, especially the ones that feel to you like they can't have been real, or maybe like they were real, but happening only to someone else, From all the violence that may be remote and alien to you, but has always been extremely local and implicit in my life, I hope you understand that I found myself in a very different story than the one most human lives play out within, looking at the world and our different places in it from an exceptionally unusual, but tragically nowhere near unique perspective. That's why I'm going back to something I said earlier, because I hope you can listen carefully to this instruction. Please, I beg of you, think of me as a space probe sent off on an orthogonal journey, a very lonely, very cold, very distant voyager, traveling very fast and further away each and every second from the normal path the majority of you get to have in common. I've struggled to use precise words so I can communicate to you precisely what I've seen from very far away. Just like that probe, I may not have seen what you have seen, but I have seen a lot of what you can't look at. What I've told you so far has all been in service of getting you to recognize and I hope accept that I am such a probe, and that what I've learned is vital for you to capture, listen to, hear, understand, and where you don't yet understand, research and pore over until you do. Now you've heard my story. You've heard my secret. Long and painful as it was, that was just the preamble. That was everything necessary to get us here. Here is the important bit. Your interstellar probe's message begins now. First, I need to make it clear I am not alone. I am not unique. I'm not special. There's nothing special about me whatsoever. The depressing thing is I'm just the normal outcome that happens when a normal child gets knocked on a different normal path. The things that happened to me weren't unique either. They weren't special. They weren't even unusual. Your thought-terminating cliches exist to protect you from this basic, actually indisputable fact. Children experiencing life-threatening physical violence and life-altering sexual violence is depressingly common, even mundane. The only remotely unusual thing about my tangent is that it started in a single event initiated by a single stranger, and that event was both violent and sexual in one go. And even there, I'm not alone. I'm nowhere near alone. I'm just either rare because both happening together is rare, or I'm rare because surviving both happening together is rare. But there have been others before me, and sadly, there will be others after me, even if we haven't met in person. I cannot stress this enough or hammer it hard enough. I really am not alone. Once you realize that boys are strongly incentivized to an absolutely absurd degree to stay silent, to keep any experience of sexual abuse or assault a lifelong secret, it will dawn on you that the statistic that only 1 in every 6 men you know have experiences of non-consensual sexual violence before the age of 18 is ludicrously low. The estimate of 1 in 4 of every girls is probably a bit closer to the mark, but not by much. There are vastly more children who have serious traumatic experiences far, far worse than my own stumbling along right now, most of them as adults, usually substantially isolated, and because most of them have never been able to disclose to anyone with very little, if any, support. And they need support, a lot of support, and we should be organizing and fighting to make sure they get it. An agonizing fact is that on literally every single day, some of those children will give up because they can't keep going without support that isn't there. And they'll leave my tribe. But the even more excruciating truth is literally every single day, many, many more children are added to our tribe than leave it. And the most horrifying reality of all is that most of the children joining my tribe and who are going to be dying for support are the children of members of my tribe who never got anything like support. And if you meet 100 adults in the next week, and you think about the fact that somewhere between 1/6 and 1/2 of them have experiences they're aware of significant childhood trauma, and that at least one of them has met, if not recognized, their inner psychopath, and the safety of all the children around you has depended the entire time on them having figured out somehow, unsupported, how to either harness that or muzzle that. What you're not thinking about right now is the ones you didn't get to meet, the one-time children who can't come out in public, can't allow themselves to be seen, wouldn't introduce themselves to begin with, didn't survive to meet you at all, or twisted their pain into someone else's. A huge number of these children, both the seen and the unseen, a truly daunting number of them, are, according to the vicious and merciless guillotine that is the BMI, either substantially overweight, substantially underweight, or currently swinging somewhere between those extremes on their own fugoid's violent curves. A lot of these children learn to self-medicate and tamp down unbearable emotional pain by controlling their food intake, just as I did. And just like me, they'll often spend a lot more time at the extremes than they do passing between them. If they're not self-medicating by gorging themselves or starving themselves, then they are much more likely than average to have self-medicated with alcohol, drugs, gambling, risky sex, or other soothing behaviors that can temporarily push away the pain and shame they're trying desperately to avoid. In the boys who I've simply had more contact with because support groups tend to self-assemble along the arbitrary lines of whatever gender is, these soothing behaviors can also look a lot like striving for a kind of hypermasculinity. While I'm certainly not saying that every man with disproportionate muscle mass shares anything like my experiences, I have met many other men who also went through one or more periods of desperately struggling to inhabit the biggest, toughest, least vulnerable body around. We who survive developing PTSD as a child tend to find our way into fugoid-inducing behaviors and often oscillate towards the extremes in many areas. Though I have noticed that those who don't reflexively put air quotes around their survival tend to have done a better job of not oscillating quite so violently as I have. I spent decades feeling like I was completely alone in all of this. In hindsight, and after meeting just a tiny fraction of those who really are my brothers and sisters, I've had to come to realize that I can see the outlines of them and where their patterns of behavior overlap with and resonate with my own. And those outlines are everywhere and only becoming louder and clearer as I become more sensitive to how using my voice, finally in public, might provoke them to raise theirs, like some of them using theirs in private has provoked me to raise mine. I am not alone. I really am not alone. But I also am not speaking for anyone else who's been exposed to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And I'm certainly not speaking for anyone else who endured the unendurable while still a child. It took me more than 20 years to even start speaking for myself. So I know that I don't dare speak for anyone else. The experience of trauma and the agony of the stress that survival brings with it, of the seemingly endless, agonizing, returning and reliving, and in many cases, revictimization, and in the worst cases, recidivism, is infinitely personal. It's an imprint far, far more personal than a fingerprint or DNA could ever be. On each return, it's rewritten. Something forces the wounds back open, and then there's the pain of stitching that back up again, and you discover it's not a story that gets to be experienced just once. I know my story well enough to tell it because there have been times it was literally carved into my body and my mind over and over again, sometimes by my own actions, but very often by bad actors or just bad luck. It is a permanent tale incised into whatever remains of what too many people, too flippantly and without enough care, call my soul, and then that imprint was baked into my clay, and even if I could scrape the entirety of it away, the ghost of that story would still remain. I don't know anyone else's story. Survival is different for everyone who has to endure it. And I really hope me telling you my tale helps others think they might want to tell their own. I cannot speak for them. No one can speak for them. No one else has earned the right to. No one else can ever earn the right to. They have earned their choice, whether it's to scream at the top of their lungs or to stay silent. And honestly, if they're not safe themselves or have discovered safe people to fall back on, then staying publicly silent might just be the better choice, especially in the comments on this video. I've been agonizing for decades about whether or not I should even speak for me because of all the very, very bad and inappropriate ways people I couldn't trust quite as much as I'd hoped have handled my disclosing my story in the past. In the years I've been publicly silent, there have been moments when it feels like I'm over it and it's behind me, and then there are moments when I know that I never will be, and that another fresh shock is just waiting around the corner. And while I want to believe most people who watch this will be human and humane about it, I'm well aware there are some who aren't interested in being either and will try to cause that shock. They'll try to do it in the comments, and where I can't delete the abuse and stupidity directed at me quickly enough, that abuse and stupidity will harm others, and I'll be responsible for that harm by proxy. That's why I've taken so much time and effort and literal pains to write this, to try and do an end run around the people who will inevitably, reflexively deploy their thought-terminating cliches, to arm those amongst you who can think against those who either can't yet or won't ever. If I've written this right, if I've said it well, if I've given you just a taste of the revisiting and the constant orbiting of this ridiculously powerful mass at the center of whatever you'd call me, then I never get to go unseen again. I never get to put my secret back inside the box I've just opened. By publishing this, I've set that box, and with it me, on fire, because I want to bring light to a darkness I know too well and can't see anyone else honestly looking at. Well, I couldn't figure out any way to do that didn't involve burning the last remaining bridges to my own safety. If I've told my story with the right words in the right voice, I've guaranteed the story remains when my body and mind, when that which remains, when the things I eventually decided to call Michael are actually dead and gone. I'm not speaking for anyone else because I can't, but also because I don't want anyone else to know what it feels like to know your secret has just been exposed and will outlive you because you've been forced to speak for yourself in unsafe places. So while I can't speak for anyone else who has endured and experienced life-altering trauma, especially very young, I hope I can speak to them. I hope they know that I have, to the very small extent that I've found others with similar experiences in this world, listened both carefully and very intently, and I hope they can understand that though each story and experience has been incredibly and painfully unique, I've also always consistently heard the same thunderous echo of unfathomable but justified and correct anger, silenced and unjustly and wrongly turned inwards into dense, unbearable shame held unbearably close. That shame wasn't deserved. That shame wasn't earned. That shame wasn't and isn't right. But none of that really matters because that shame is still what we received. And once you've received that shame, it can and will grow and grow so powerful and so tight and knotted and dense at the center of us that it threatens our survival, even though the problem is we can't let it go because it's how we survived in the first place. And people who don't have that shame and don't understand it, who don't know it in their bodies, literally in the always clenched and squeezing muscles, in the pain, the physical pain that's always there whenever we're awake and sometimes in our dreams. Those people, the normal ones, they'll so often respond to our language in a language we don't understand at all, but which we're supposed to. We'll try to speak about things we might well have been too young to even form words around, and they'll respond with words we'll stab ourselves with too often before they've heard us get the poison all the way out to begin with. In our hands, a loving word can be a dagger, an angry word a spear, if we try to open Our hearts of darkness, if our secret is even slightly exposed, then it doesn't even take a word. Just a widening of the eyes or a misplaced laugh or a hint of disbelief can become artillery we'll fire against ourselves over and over and over. And this is from those tiny few, that may be one or two in what feels like a lifetime, that we just hope we can trust, but usually can't, and so don't. Together, I hope we can tell the world that shares none of our experiences and who haven't gone down these disturbingly similar paths to uncomfortably similar ends to stop responding to what they can't and don't understand, especially before we finish speaking, to start listening with unstoppered ears, and most importantly, to stop forcing us to turn our anger inwards, to stop making the victims responsible for what the perpetrators did to them. And the world that hasn't had to discover the enormous, unfathomable, aching gulf between getting to live instead of just getting to survive has forced us to do exactly that, to silence our anger, build our shame, and remain silent about both. Not usually out of malice, not usually out of bad intentions. In fact, it's often out of a misguided, ignorant, self-centered version of love. Compassion from those who don't yet know compassion, from those who think they've got empathy because they've been told they do, and just haven't discovered yet that they don't. It's also not usually active. It's just a passive form of pressure to keep secret what is secret, to keep unsaid what can't easily be said, to be stoic where that's inappropriate, to keep calm and carry on as if you're in the Blitz, when what you should be doing is running riot, because where you actually are is much nearer to the ghetto or the camps or the ovens than they can possibly know or understand. It can take years, even decades, to tease apart and clear away the rubble left behind by an innocent and ignorant parent or teacher or doctor or sibling or partner's less than careful choice of words. That's how easily those who are prone to triggering can be silenced and set back. I can hope we can tell the world to stop clinging to old, bad, stupid ideas and start evolving its use of language. Where that doesn't work yet, start evolving language itself. And where the language changes in a way that makes you uncomfortable, maybe shut your mouth, stop speaking for a bit, actually hear why that language is changing, and only then speak again. Don't just have an opinion until you've built it from first principles. And unless you've trained yourself in formal logic, don't assume you have the slightest clue what those first principles even are. Earlier, I gave just a little bit of time and voice to why there's a real and important and meaningful difference between culpability, liability, and responsibility. That wasn't me going on a tangent. That was me trying to show you where a shared language can lay landmines in front of people who might share only the words of that language but not the context. People who, like me, are walking around with a very different, and I'll argue much more nuanced dictionary. I can't explain to every human I meet before I start talking to them how them telling me that I'm not responsible for what happened to me while they leave me the one picking up the pieces substantially misrepresents reality, leaving them in a much more comfortable and placated place than I've ever been or probably ever will be. And if I haven't been able to explain responsibility to someone whose actual job it is to help me when I'm the one paying for every moment of their precious time, then how can I possibly explain that telling me that I deserve better without explaining in detail how and when they're going to deliver that better is at best a meaningless platitude, while at worst they've undermined me with false hope. The English language, especially when it's deployed by someone who has power of care over someone in a crisis who they only think they can empathize with, can do immense harm. Well, again, I'm not alone, and I know both "you're not responsible" and "you deserve better" have actually set me and others like me back to a much greater degree than they've helped us forward in my journey to understand my shame and why it's so inextricable from my too many experiences of trauma, including trauma that really was just handed down to me by others when they couldn't keep their own shame contained. I got held back a lot by one more not carefully and not precisely deployed word, and I know it's held others back as well. I swear this video will end hopefully soon, so I'm not going to expand the definitions of each and every word in the English language for you, but I'm afraid I've got to expand at least this one more. Over the years, I've heard a lot of well-meaning but sadly clumsy people, including a far too significant number of trained mental health professionals, and you'll just have to understand that I've had way more interaction with mental health professionals than average, describe the mental illnesses I've personally experienced and embodied, PTSD, CPTSD, and depression, as being either caused by or somehow linked to what they term repressed emotions. That is an example of language that needs to evolve because it is an extremely thought-terminating cliche. And while it might sound insignificant, it held me back for years as I wasted time going down an intellectual cul-de-sac trying to unearth what had never been buried in the first place. That idea of repressed emotions is another holdover from our old friend Sigmund Freud, who I've also had way more interaction with than average because some deep misunderstandings about his least scientific ideas, and that's really saying something because not a single one of his ideas was even remotely scientific, ended up accidentally forming the weak foundations of both modern psychology and, for some bizarre reason, film theory. They're wrong. Both Freud was back then, and the well-meaning, and especially the professionals, have been throughout my life and up to today. The idea that these maladies result from me repressing my own emotions by me pushing them from my conscious mind into some imagined subconscious is as idiotic as blaming my symptoms on the moon, demonic possession, or too much phlegm and black bile and not enough bloodletting. Do I sound remotely unconscious of these emotions or their effects on me? Post-traumatic stress is the stress a human body is supposed to feel, consciously feel, after experiencing traumatic psychological injury. That stress is supposed to make them and those around them aware that they've been wounded, so that those wounds can be tended. Well, when those wounds aren't addressed with appropriate care by experts in an ordered manner, they're going to get addressed with inappropriate care by amateurs in a disordered one. In the worst case, by an amateur child with no clue that an ordered response is either possible or discoverable, and that's exactly what happened to me. That's how post-traumatic stress goes from not quite being allowed to be consciously felt and expressed and considered and dealt with, to being unconsciously or consciously avoided and allowed to fester into PTSD. Throw someone, especially a child with PTSD, into a spin cycle of ever more inappropriate reactions and responses to the same old and still untreated wounds, and complex PTSD is the natural, and at that point likely the only possible, outcome. I never repressed a single emotion in Freud's sense of keeping them subconscious to myself. I never even got the opportunity to. I was too busy surviving by hiding my emotions, my experiences, and therefore my safety and my wounds and my need for care from the emotional discomfort of others. I had experienced something I literally didn't have words to know how to articulate, and when I displayed understandable and entirely natural emotions of extreme distress in the only way anyone should ever expect from a child, I wasn't heard. I wasn't listened to. Instead, I was first ignored, then beaten, and then starved of both food and affection. My unbearable emotions were so unbearable to others that I had to silence those emotions for their benefit and my survival. I had to start to develop the secrets both they, and if we're being honest, you, wanted me to keep. Of course that led to suicidal thoughts, then homicidal thoughts, then worse, as I struggled with emotions I still consciously had and have, but which virtually everyone in my life has wanted to remain studiously unconscious of, because getting me to discipline and control my emotional outbursts, my episodes, meant never even having to think of what they were a sign of. PTSD has nothing to do with repressed fear. It's the physical and mental sign and signifier that you've learned that life is dangerous and scary and very often is nasty, brutish, and short. It's waking up to the fear you should have in the reality you actually live in, from the dream of safety you shouldn't have in the delusion you actually don't live in. Depression has nothing to do with repressed anger. It's primarily a sign of physical and mental exhaustion. It can be brought on by any number of stressors operating within a human body for a long enough time. And one of those stressors is anger you justifiably have, which is entirely appropriate, and that you are completely and constantly and consciously aware of, but that you simply can't act on or express because other people don't want to know that life is dangerous and scary and very often nasty, brutish, and short. That's what's so infuriating about the farcical, but for some reason still popular notion of mental illnesses like mine being somehow about repressed emotions. Learning to repress what you do with your personal emotions is actually a fundamental milestone in developing into a mature social being. And learning to repress what we do with our collective emotions is just as fundamentally a milestone in developing a mature society and culture. We're supposed to feel our emotions, but we're supposed to choose if we act on them or ignore them. And both a mature being and a mature society composed of such beings would, by default, choose to ignore, by default, and not act at all. Not comfortable with either of those ideas? Well, whoever told you that you or your society were mature and had passed those milestones? What evidence do you have that you've grown up or that your society has? Every culture in human history has thought of itself as mature and advanced, thought of itself as the top towards the end of history, looking down at all those ignorant fools that came before, rather than as at the bottom, at the beginning, looking up at something substantially more advanced that's looking down at them. Just like every human being has looked to the stars and wondered if there's intelligent life out there, without first confirming that there's any intelligent life down here. Never mind confirming if there is between these two ears. Well, I'm going to suggest that any society or culture in which a child can endure death, serious injury, or especially sexual violence hasn't reached the threshold of maturity and isn't advanced. And if that society or culture can't respond to that child in such a way that it prevents that child from enduring those conditions again, never mind allowing that child to carry that forward throughout their life and even into future generations, then the species that forms that society or culture and all the individuals in it might not have yet passed the threshold of intelligence, and certainly can't be assumed to have. We should all be able to feel whatever we feel, whenever and wherever we feel it. Because our emotions are an unbidden, extremely noisy, and usually unhelpful message from the dark, we probably should allow ourselves even more freedom of emotion, freedom of feeling, than we do freedom of thought. Just like we should allow ourselves much greater freedom of thought than we should ever grant ourselves freedom of speech. A mature, thinking, adult being should very likely not allow itself to blurt out aloud whatever fleeting idiot thought or emotion pops up and tries to motivate its tongue. An actually thinking being doesn't and shouldn't voice every thought that comes to mind just because it comes to mind, and should only extremely rarely, after thought and care and attention, give voice to its emotions. But a child isn't supposed to be a thinking being. Not yet. They're supposed to mature and grow into one. They're supposed to feel what they feel and express those feelings, and then, after they learn to think, start setting aside the messages of their feelings and start listening more to the messages of their minds. Maybe, after a great deal of effort, probably more effort than currently fits into one human life, they might reach the point where they can shut the hell up and only ever say the important thoughts. The thoughts that change the courses of future lives. The thoughts that can only be voiced by the thinker who has mastered their feeler enough to not let it dominate their thinking or speak on their behalf. Someone who has actually repressed their emotions doesn't often act on them, and never does when acting on their fleeting emotional needs or desires would damage the safety or sanctity of another. Someone who has actually repressed their emotions has taken responsibility for them. If my first rapist, either of my parents or my second rapist, had actually repressed their emotions, I wouldn't have a secret to tell you today. They didn't, so I do. You see, this is another place in which precise words are important, in which I need to teach you how to speak my language using the same tools I've been using all my life to survive amongst a species that doesn't actually share even a word of that language. There's a reason I'm much more comfortable in a crowd of people who don't speak a word of English than I am in a crowd of people who do, but don't weaponize that language the way I do. Etymologically, to repress something is to hold it back, to restrain it, to control or inhibit it, to keep it from acting, possibly, but not necessarily, by some active force. To suppress something is to hold it down or under. They've got similar meanings. I can see why psychologists conflate the two. They're human, after all, and even this far removed from Freud, they are still thinking in a kind of squishy and less than rigorous way about the kind of squishy, less than rigorous things happening inside human minds. But they're not exactly or precisely the same meaning, and again, for this to be communication, it's important to be precise. Freud was talking about people pushing emotions from their conscious mind into their subconscious, literally their below conscious or under conscious mind. And he was writing in German, and he used the word unterdrückt, literally underheld, which is etymologically identical to suppress, but importantly not repress. My guess is the reason why English-speaking Freudian psychoanalysts, and then from those loonies, modern psychologists, chose repress is because repression is usually volitional, done by an entity against itself, whereas suppression and oppression imply something done by a stronger against a weaker. It allows them to maintain the delusion of an internal locus of control. It literally lets the therapist make the patient responsible for their own problems, which is useful because it also lets them make the patient liable for those problems, or at least for the fees for their session. Now, there's lots of good to be had through therapy, don't get me wrong, but what you'll find there isn't exactly precision. And when we're talking about my emotions, if you're going to throw around a word that implies I'm choosing to push them back for some reason into a part of my mind that is for some reason down, then it's vitally important we're really clear on precisely whom is doing the repressing. I'm the one being repressed, that's clear. They're my emotions, after all. But is the repressor me or someone else? If it were me pushing these emotions down into the subconscious Freud and his followers were talking about, then I wouldn't be consciously aware of these emotions or the fact that I've been holding them back the whole time. And I can say with exceptional, even violent clarity, that I have never not been aware of the intensity of my feelings. I just didn't always have precise or nuanced names for those feelings, never mind either the skills or the vocabulary or sufficient safety around others to be able to express them properly. I knew they were there. I just couldn't understand what they were saying because they were so loud they were deafening, and I couldn't figure out on my own how to give them voice without causing discomfort, unease, pain, or actual harm to others. If it were me, but what I'm repressing isn't the emotions, but the acts those emotions would otherwise cause me to impress upon the world, then given the impulses I've only barely let you know about, then well, and I say this without even a hint of pride because I literally won't ever get to feel any unless I witness myself dying not by my own hand. Am I not some kind of a hero that all of you who would otherwise have been my victims should thank for that repression? Why, in other words, would there be any mental distress for me involved in me repressing my own emotions? Sure, it may have been distressing before I passed that milestone, but I've been keeping myself from acting on my emotions since before I actually knew I had them. I passed that milestone on the first day of school. I had to. If I hadn't repressed action driven by emotion immediately after discovering what could happen to a little boy's body when an adult man unbuckled his belt, I wouldn't have survived long enough to tell anyone I'd been murdered. The problem is not that I started to repress my emotions early. The problem is that after I miraculously repressed them early, and I survived the unsurvivable, and I got home and tried to express the unexpressible when and where I was supposed to be safe to do so, I wasn't actually safe to do so. My emotions weren't repressed by me into my subconscious. They were oppressed or pushed against and suppressed or pushed down by others so that they could remain unconscious. Again, I really don't blame them. All they did was come up against something threatening to them, and they deployed their own body's most basic, most intrinsic, most fundamentally built-in human form of thought-terminating cliché. And in their acute stress responses, they felt crisis too, and they took their own paths of least resistance to avoiding their stress. And it just so happened the way had already been prepared that morning in that bathroom, and that way went through me by suppressing my emotional expressions. And it kept going through me, because anytime my extreme emotions bubbled up again in the future, everyone tried to silence the symptoms without ever trying to address the disease. It wasn't long before that repetition taught me to do that violence to myself, to stop letting them bubble up at all, to just hide them behind my mask and suffer both the symptoms and the disease in silence. The implication when some well-meaning, but usually kind of unthinking and almost certainly more inexperienced than me in enduring CPTSD person says I need to stop repressing my own emotions is that I'm the one responsible for those emotions, when in fact, this time, what I am is liable for them. I am not the one charged with the ability to respond to my emotions. After my anger was driven inward, after I had to literally impress my own justifiable rage and horror rather than express it, no one could respond to my emotions because they were only ever witnessed in the years between my first rape and my second, but they were never, not once, not remotely, heard. A very small number of people, decades after the fact, started to become responsible for my emotions, my closest friends and family, and eventually, after much building of trust, an extreme minority of my professional caregivers. But at the time, and really into my mid-30s, there was no one capable of responding to what wasn't being and couldn't be said out loud, some of which I can still barely say out loud to this day. If it remains unspoken, it cannot be responded to. Until right here and right now, the public was never going to be responsible. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. I've made you one of the responsible. Please go be responsible in the comments. I, however, was never responsible, and I never could be responsible for the very significant, if easily overlooked reason, that with my extreme hypervigilance, the very last place I could ever endure being is stuck alone screaming inside an echo chamber. No, what I was, what I've always been made to be by others, not with bad intentions, but usually with love and good intentions that still inflicted intense suffering, is liable for those emotions. I am the one that pays the price for having them, and I've paid that price by first learning to defensively and then eventually learning to compulsively hammer my unbearable anger into unbearable and unspeakable shame. Unspeakable shame that now forms the supermassive black hole at the center of me. The thing that doesn't just swallow the light, the thing from which not even the darkness can escape. Now, decades later, I know in my head that the best our current understanding of human psychology has to offer is that I somehow need to get myself to express, in the sense of push or release outwards, that rage. To again, somehow, either melt down or break open the shame, which I never earned and shouldn't have, and release the anger, which I absolutely earned and should definitely have. in order to somehow reach catharsis. I know again in my head that somehow expressing it, really expressing it, not merely feeling it, which I do constantly and consciously, but almost exclusively in private and behind the mask, and also not merely talking about it, which again, I do all the time in private, but I passed the point where talking about my feelings could give me any more forward momentum more than a decade ago. But actually releasing the most unsafe and uncontrolled thing bound within me in some sort of somehow safe and controlled manner is vital to undoing and expelling the incredibly dense knot of shame I've allowed the pathologically psychopathic survival mechanisms that were written into me simply for being human to build. The problem is I've got no idea how to do that. No one, amateur, professional, or otherwise, has ever given me even the slightest clue how to do so. And after decades of diligent, exhaustive searching, desperately trying to find some means of doing so, seeking in the cracks and corners of religions and philosophies and science and the weird and blurry smearing of the lines of those three we call psychology, I've had to come to the conclusion that the tools or technology that I'd need to allow me to accomplish that task just don't yet exist. The words certainly don't exist. The English language simply lacks the ability to carry enough context to open up my Pandora's box and expel its contents, and I don't think any other natural language can do better. Paint, clay, pictures of any kind, these are, if anything, less expressive than words, even more open to interpretation. The whole thing began not when I was injured, but when I screamed and was not heard, when I pointed at the truth but was not understood. What possible value could there ever be in me speaking and not being understood, in not communicating yet again, in revisiting and reliving but not actually expressing my trauma yet again? Maybe if there was some sort of a programming language for human brains where I could just flip a bit and cause undefined behavior, side effects in others because of something I did in myself. But that's frankly a research question for the future, and at best science fiction, and at worst fantasy for now. The reality is that when I was far too young to be introduced to either sex or violence, I was introduced to both. And that impact left me hot and shaking in the dark, and that started the nucleus of my shame growing because I'd bitten into knowledge I hadn't been prepared to receive and that I wasn't supposed to have access to yet. Knowledge that the adults around me weren't equipped to talk about because they'd been raised by adults who weren't equipped to talk about it. Two filters that a human life, in theory, isn't supposed to engage with until after their brains and bodies have at least stopped growing were in reality applied to me before I could reliably form permanent memories. They started altering the course of my brain and my body's development before that development had actually begun. I was shown that my consent didn't matter, that my choices didn't matter, that my body's desires or its safety didn't matter, that its life, that my life simply didn't matter. Then when I tried to express a little of the anger that violation forced into me and my body, the two people who were required by a stupid, unthinking society to be responsible for me without ever being trained, prepared, or supported in any way in how to be, turned that anger immediately inward, hammering it into and onto my developing, growing core of shame. Their bad messaging about food and weight kept that mass growing and set me up so that when I was reintroduced to both sex and violence, again too early, I turned even worse anger, even more inward, and with every swing of the phugoid since, more anger was added to more shame. That all this happened was wrong, fundamentally wrong, but that knowledge of the culpability of others doesn't give me any way of responsibly addressing it. As far as I can tell, the window of opportunity for me to be able to open my shame and express the anger entombed within it safely closed a long, long time ago. Probably the day I met my psychopath. See, I know exactly how angry I am. I know precisely why that anger is aimed squarely at me. I know why it has to be aimed at me, never anyone else. I know why I can't express that anger safely, and I know that shame is how I keep that anger constrained. Not repressed by me, but impressed within me after it was suppressed by others, and I had nowhere else to put it. Shame and self-loathing is the mechanism I am using, consciously using, to constrain and inhibit what I constrain and inhibit. That intense self-loathing has been expressed at times by food I've forced down my throat and fat I've packed around my body. At times by lifting weights so heavy they permanently damage muscle, tendon, and bone. At times through acts of torturous violence to my own flesh. And now by standing in front of my stomach's indescribable, unending hunger and refusing to let it feed. But always it's there to constrain and inhibit that which I must constrain and inhibit, that which for the sake of everyone else I cannot fail to constrain and inhibit. I can describe what that is, but I can't really communicate what that is. I've tried for decades to find any way whatsoever to safely communicate what that is, but it remains unspeakable. After a lifetime of studying how to express, I've had to realize and accept that it's simply not yet possible to safely allow human beings, including the one I inhabit, the one that I'm within, to come into direct contact with what it is I have walled off inside of me. This video exists because a lot of people couldn't really empathize with my inhumane and nearly inhuman capacity for constraining and inhibiting my body. I've explained how that capacity developed, how anger turned violently inward left me wearing a body that can't feel its own pain or emotions, that I'm entombed within. But if you're impressed by the walls, how the hell do I tell you about what I built those walls to entomb within here with me? Thank you for listening to Transmission Begins, the 7th episode of this 8-part series. My story concludes in episode 8, Transmission Ends, available now.